There were 4,000 motorcycles in a small California Valley town on the 4th of July weekend, 1947. And by the following Monday morning, a single photograph, staged, paid for, arranged in the dirt by a magazine photographer, had erased 40 years of real American history and replaced it with a lie we are still telling today. That town was Hollister. You've probably heard the name. You've probably heard it described as the place where motorcycle gangs took over, terrorized the locals, and gave birth to the outlaw biker. Marlon Brando made a movie about it. The whole image of the leather-jacketed rebel on two wheels traces straight back to that weekend. Almost none of it is true. The real motorcycle culture of the 1950s in California, the veterans, the working men, the women who raced and won, the black clubs building their own world because they had been locked out of everyone else's, the desert racers who were the most skilled riders this country ever produced. That culture was buried. Not because it died, because a camera pointed somewhere else, and Hollywood sold the country a costume instead of the truth. I'm Jimmy. This is the real story of what California motorcycling actually was in the 1950s, who killed the truth of it, and why the lie was so much easier to sell than the thing it replaced. And it's the first stop in a journey we are going to take across the whole country, the 1950s, state by state, the way it really happened. We start in California because California is where the myth was born. To understand what was destroyed, you have to understand what was there first. And what was there first was the most democratic machine America had ever built. Go back to the very beginning of the century. The Indian Motorcycle Company started in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1901. Harley-Davidson followed in Milwaukee in 1903. And by 1910, there were dozens of American motorcycle makers, all fighting for the attention of a public that had just discovered something miraculous. A machine that could move faster than a horse, needed less care than an automobile, and that a working man could actually afford before he could ever dream of owning a car. That's the part the myth erases first. The motorcycle in early America was not a rebel's toy. It was a working man's freedom. It was the most affordable fast transportation on Earth, and the people who fell in love with it were exactly the people you'd expect: farmers, factory workers, miners, postal carriers, delivery men. Men for whom the machine was practical first and joyful second, and who discovered that the practical thing also happened to feel like flying. By 1920, they had built an institution around it. The American Motorcyclists Association, the AMA, was formed to sanction racing, organize clubs, and give structure to a culture that was growing faster than anyone expected. And the membership of that organization through the 1920s and 30s was working class to the bone. This was civic life. American small-town civic life, organized around a machine. And here's the part that got erased most completely of all. The women rode. Before anyone thought to call it remarkable, the women rode. In 1915, a woman named Effie Hotchkiss rode a motorcycle across the entire United States, New York, to San Francisco and back, with her mother sitting in the sidecar. She was 26 years old. There were no paved roads for most of that route. There was no map worth the name for a motorcycle. There was a Harley-Davidson, a sidecar, a mother along for the ride, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided to do a thing and simply was not interested in the list of reasons it couldn't be done. A year later, in 1916, two sisters, Augusta and Adeline Van Buren, became the first women to ride motorcycles across America on their own machines. When they finished, they applied to serve as Army dispatch riders to put that hard-won skill to use. The Army turned them down because they were women. The AMA wouldn't even certify their ride for the same reason. They did it anyway. And then American popular culture forgot they existed for the next 40 years. That's who was there. That's the culture the 1950s inherited. Group rides the AMA called gypsy tours. Hill climbs and flat track races where riders competed for trophies, not territory. Picnics, barbecues, camping trips, families. A community organized around a machine that everyone in it owned and loved and knew how to fix. And then a generation of men went to war and came home carrying something that the quiet suburban country they returned to could not hold: The men who came back from World War II came back changed. They'd left as teenagers and come home in their 30s. They'd seen things they couldn't describe and done things they couldn't talk about. And they came back to an America that desperately wanted to pretend none of it had happened. It wanted normal, wanted quiet, wanted the lawn and the picket fence and the conformity of the suburban dream as fast as it could get them. Some of these men could not do it, not because they were dangerous, because they had been somewhere that ordinary life could no longer reach. And the motorcycle was the one machine available that came close to the thing they were missing: the speed, the weather on your face, the total exposure, the mechanical intimacy of a machine that answers instantly to every single thing you ask of it. And most of all, the company of other men who had also been somewhere the civilian world would never understand. So they form clubs. And the names they chose are where the misunderstanding begins. The Booze Fighters, the Pissed Off Bastards of Bloomington, the Market Street Commandos. To your ears in this century, those names sound like threats. In 1946, they were jokes. They were the dark, self-deprecating humor of men who had survived something enormous and needed a name for the group they survived it with. Most of these clubs were not outlaw organizations. They were veterans organizations that happened to ride motorcycles. They rode the gypsy tours, they entered the hill climbs, and the flat track events. They operated inside the exact same American Motorcyclists Association framework that had defined this culture for 20 years before the war. The Booze Fighters, the very club that would get blamed for everything, was founded in 1946 by a World War II veteran named Winnow Willie Faulkner in a bar in South Central Los Angeles. The name was a joke about a man who liked to ride and liked to drink. He was not a violent man. He spent the rest of his life saying so. And that is the culture, real, documented, working class, family-centered, full of veterans and women and trophies and picnics that rode into Hollister, California on the 4th of July, 1947. Here's what actually happened that weekend. The Salinas Ramblers Motorcycle Club had organized an AMA sanctioned gypsy tour to Hollister. The county fairgrounds had racing on the schedule. The town had hosted motorcycle events for years without a single serious incident. Roughly 4,000 riders came into a town of about 4,500 people. Most of them came for the racing. Some came for the beer. A small handful belonged to no club at all and had no interest in anything on the schedule. And yes, there were incidents. Some minor property damage, public drunkenness, a few fistfights. The town jail, which held 10 people, got stretched. But the local police weren't overwhelmed because the riders were violent. They were overwhelmed because 4,000 unexpected visitors had just doubled the population of a town that had no infrastructure to handle it. It was, in the words of the Hollister chief of police himself, just one hell of a big party. A party, that's what it was. A loud holiday weekend in a small town that got messy. No organized violence, no weapons, no siege, noise, beer bottles in the gutter, and the specific chaos of too many people in too small a place. But the San Francisco Chronicle had sent a reporter, and the dispatch that went out was a great deal more dramatic than a big party. The Associated Press picked it up, and Life magazine, the most powerful photo magazine in the country, the publication that told America what America looked like, sent a photographer named Barney Peterson to capture it. When Peterson arrived, there was no town under siege to photograph. There is the morning after mess of a holiday weekend. So he made the photograph the story needed. He found a 29-year-old rider named Eddie Davenport who was willing to sit on a motorcycle. The bike wasn't even Davenport's, it was borrowed. The beer bottles were gathered up from the surrounding gutters and arranged around him in the frame. Davenport was told to look like a mess and hold a beer. And Peterson took the shot. The caption "Life" ran beneath it. Motorcyclists take over town. In America, a country that had just survived a world war and was secretly terrified about what its returning soldiers had become, looked at that staged photograph and saw every one of its fears confirmed. The men who came home were not entirely tame. The motorcycle was the proof. Hollister was the first town to fall. Every part of that was wrong. The photo was staged, the caption was invented, the bottles were arranged. The man wasn't an outlaw, the bike wasn't his, and the town hadn't been taken over by anyone. The chief of police said so. The town record said so. The residents said so. Nobody was listening because the lay was already on its way to becoming a movie. And before I tell you how Hollywood turned that lie into the most influential motorcycle film ever made, if you've made it this far, you already understand that this is not the version of the story you were handed. So do something with it. Send this video to the rider in your life who's been on two wheels for 30 years and thinks he knows where all of this came from. Drop it in your motorcycle groups, your forums, the places your people actually gather. The history that gets buried stays buried until somebody decides to dig it up and pass it around. You sharing this is how the true version gets out. Now the movie, The Wild One, was released at the very end of 1953. Marlon Brando as Johnny, leader of a motorcycle club. Lee Marvin as his rival. It was based loosely on a short story which was based loosely on Hollister, and the distance between what happened at Hollister and what happens in that film is the distance between a loud party and a military occupation. The film opens with a title card. This is a shocking story. It could never take place in most American towns, but it did in this one. And then it shows riders terrorizing a town, menacing its citizens, holding a young woman against her will, behaving like an invading army. It was condemned by the censors, it was banned outright in Britain for 14 years, and it became the single most culturally powerful motorcycle film ever made, because it handed the American public a complete visual language for the motorcycle rider, and that language was frightening and thrilling at the same time. Brando's Johnny wasn't played as a villain, he was played as a lost soul. When a girl asks him what he's rebelling against and he says, "What do you got?" That line didn't make the audience afraid. It made them want to be him. That's the specific damage. Before The Wild One, a motorcycle rider was a working man who rode for practical and joyful reasons. After The Wild One, a motorcycle rider was a rebel, a coherent cultural type with an attitude and an aesthetic set against everything respectable America claimed to value. And the industry understood what had happened before the riders did. Leather jacket sales jumped in the years after the film. The look of the movie club, the cap, the leather, the dungarees became a costume before it ever became a culture. Men who had never thrown a leg over a motorcycle bought the jacket because Brando wore it. And here's where I'll give you my honest opinion, because I think this is the exact moment the whole thing turned. That shift from a practical garment a working rider wore to a costume a non-rider bought is the moment the motorcycle industry lost the culture it had spent 50 years building. Not because the jacket was wrong, because the jacket became more important than the machine. The symbol swallowed the substance, and the people who showed up chasing the symbol slowly changed what the thing actually was. Now here's what makes this story so maddening. While Hollywood was building this myth, the real California motorcycle culture wasn't gone. It was right there the whole time, bigger and richer than the myth in every way. The camera just refused to point at it. In the early 1950s, the AMA had around 100,000 registered members, dues-paying members of sanctioned clubs, running dozens of organized events across the country every year, gypsy tours, hill climbs, flat track racing, endurance runs, field meets. Clubs with boring, civic, beautiful names like the Fresno Motorcycle Club and the Denver Motorcycle Club, family events, summer weekends. 100,000 people living the real thing while the country watched a few thousand on a movie screen. And the women were winning. At a time when American institutions actively discouraged women from competing in almost any sport, motorcycle competition was a strange and wonderful exception. There was a woman named Dorothy Robinson, Dot Robinson, who was the most decorated female motorcycle competitor in American history to that point. She won over 200 endurance and rally events. She won the Jack Pine Enduro, a brutal 500-mile, 2-day race through Michigan forest in all weather, competing against men. Not a women's division. The event. Life magazine actually photographed her in 1948 and treated her as a curiosity, the housewife who happened to be America's greatest woman rider. She wasn't a curiosity. She was the product of a culture that had been building women's competition for 30 years. There was Linda Dujo, who co-founded the Motor Maids in 1940, the oldest all-women motorcycle organization in America, after riding clear across the country to meet Dot Robinson. By the mid-1950s, the Motor Maids had chapters nationwide, and their members competed at every level of AMA events. None of it made the movies. The outlaw films had no women riders at all, only women to be threatened or rescued. The camera had decided motorcycling was a masculine drama, and so the women who built it simply vanished from the picture. And then there's the part of this story that was erased twice over, buried by the myth, and buried again by a culture that didn't want to look. The black motorcycle community. In 1959 in Oakland, California, a man named Toby Gene Livingston founded a club called the East Bay Dragons. He'd started riding in the 1950s at a time when the AMA, the governing body of all this organized American motorcycle culture, still had a whites-only membership policy. So the black clubs that formed in Oakland and Los Angeles and Detroit and Chicago built an entire parallel world. Their own runs, their own events, their own community infrastructure, because the official one had locked the door. The mainstream motorcycle press of the day did not cover a minute of it. Most history channels still won't. It is one of the great untold chapters of American riding, and it happened right here in California, while Hollywood was busy filming a man in a leather jacket sneering at a small town. And then, after Hollister and after the Wild One, the AMA did something that caused more lasting damage than the photograph or the film combined. It tried to defend its riders, and in doing so, it handed the myth its permanent symbol. The statement, as it comes down to us, was this: that the trouble was caused by the 1% of motorcyclists who are outlaws, and that the other 99% are good, decent, law-abiding citizens. Now, and this matters for your understanding of how myths get built. Scholars who've gone looking through the AMA's records have never actually been able to find that statement in that exact form. It may be a distillation of things the AMA said. It may be the summary of a press release that didn't survive. It may have been partly invented later and pinned on the AMA because it was just too useful a story. But whatever its true origin, look at what it produced. It created the 1%er. The clubs that rejected the AMA's whole framing, that rejected the idea that being a good, law-abiding rider was the measure of a real one, took the insult and wore it as a badge. The 1% patch. The Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Pagans, the Banditos, the clubs that would become the famous outlaw organizations, all adopted that 1% identity, not as a confession of being criminals, but as a rejection of the AMA's authority to tell them what a legitimate rider was. Sit with the irony. The AMA tried to draw a clean line between the good riders and the bad ones to protect the culture, and the line it drew became the most powerful recruiting symbol the outlaw image ever had. In the mid-1950s, the total membership of every club that would ever be called a 1% organization was, at most, a few thousand people against an AMA membership of 100,000 and a riding public several hundred thousand strong. The outlaws were a tiny fringe. Hollywood and a magazine caption made that fringe the center of the entire story. While all of this was happening, there was another California motorcycle culture developing that no film has ever properly told, and that most riders today know almost nothing about. The desert racers. The off-road world that came out of the Southwest in the late 1940s and grew through the 1950s into the most technically demanding motorcycle culture America has ever produced. The Mojave Desert does not forgive a single mistake. The dry lake beds and rocky passes and arroyos of the California and Nevada deserts demanded a specific machine, light, and tough, and able to survive terrain that would tear a road bike apart, and a specific kind of rider. The desert racer of the 1950s was not performing an identity. He was solving a problem. How do you cross brutal desert terrain at speed without dying? The answer was deep mechanical knowledge, real physical fitness, thousands of miles of hard-won skill, and a machine he had very likely built or heavily modified with his own hands. The events that defined it included the Big Bear Run, the Greenhorn Enduro, and the Catalina Grand Prix, run right on an island off the California coast. The riders who won them, men like Bud Ekins and Malcolm Smith, were among the most skilled motorcyclists in the country. None of them were outlaws. None of them showed up in the popular press as the face of motorcycling, because the popular press already knew what a motorcyclist looked like. He looked like Marlon Brando in a leather jacket, not like a man covered in dust crossing the finish line of a 200-mile desert race. Even Steve McQueen, the movie star, belonged to this world. He started riding in the early 1950s. He raced enduros. He competed for the United States team at the International Six Days Trial in 1964 and came home with a silver medal. By the cold standard of results, he was one of the finest racers America produced in that era. But the thing Hollywood made him famous for was a single scene in The Great Escape, jumping a motorcycle over a fence. And even that was made possible by the desert racing world, because his friend and fellow desert racer, Bud Ekins, is the man who actually performed the most famous part of the stunt. The single most iconic motorcycle moment in film history was built on the exact California culture that Hollywood had spent a decade pretending did not exist. That was the machine world holding all of this up, by the way, and it asked everything of the people in it. The Harley Panhead of the early 1950s leaked oil, needed its valves adjusted, its timing checked, its carburetor jetted for the altitude you were riding at. A man who owned one was a mechanic, 'cause he had to be. The nearest dealer might be 50 miles away, and the machine broke in ways that meant a roadside repair or a long walk. The Indian chief, the last great Indian before the company collapsed in 1953, left its loyal riders with the specific grief of watching the machine they loved become impossible to keep running because the company that built it was simply gone. This was a culture of knowledge, of Saturday mornings with your hands inside an engine so it would run right on Sunday. And Hollywood replaced all of that hard-won knowledge with a jacket and an attitude, because the jacket was so much easier to sell. So did California's real motorcycle culture die in the 1950s? Here's where two things are true at the same time, and you have to hold both of them. The first true thing is that it never actually died. It was right there the whole time, and in many ways it was thriving. 100,000 AMA members, Dot Robinson winning enduros against men, the motormaids spreading across the country, the East Bay Dragons and the Black Clubs building a whole parallel world in Oakland, the desert racers becoming the best riders on the continent. The real culture of 1950s California was bigger, deeper, more skilled, and more genuinely American than the myth ever was. As a living thing that people actually did, it was alive and well. And the second true thing, living right alongside the first, is that in the only place that ultimately mattered, the public imagination, the story America told itself about who rides motorcycles, the real culture lost completely. It was buried under a staged photograph in a Marlon Brando movie. The veterans became thugs. The champion women vanished. The Black Clubs were erased, the desert racers were ignored, and the costume replaced the machine. The culture survived in the world and died in the story, and the story is the part that gets passed down. That is the tragedy of California in the 1950s. Not that the writers disappeared. They did not. It is that the truth of them did, and a lie took its place, and the lie was so much more profitable, so much easier to film and sell and wear, that 70 years later we are still buying it back from the people who took it from us. So think about it. 4,000 writers at a holiday party in a valley town, a police chief who called it nothing worse than a big weekend, a photographer arranging beer bottles in the dirt around a borrowed bike, a caption that said, "Take over town," over a picture of a man who took over nothing. A movie that opened by promising you it was real, a leather jacket selling faster than the machines it was supposed to be worn on, a woman who won the Jack Pine Against Men filed under curiosity, a club in Oakland building its own world because the door was locked, a desert racer crossing a finish line that no camera was pointed at, and a whole true history sitting right there in plain sight while the country stared at the lie. Here's the question I cannot put down, and it is bigger than motorcycles. We tend to believe that the truth wins in the end, that what really happened is stronger than what somebody made up about it. But Hollister proves the opposite, does it not? The true thing was bigger, better, and more real in every measurable way. And it lost anyway, because the lie was easier to sell. So maybe the real question this leaves us with is not what happened in California in the 1950s. We know what happened. The question is how often it is still happening. How much of what you think you know about your own history is just the version that was easier to sell you. Next time we cross the state line and we keep going. The 1950s, the way it really happened, one state at a time.